some of the things I was bringing up. So we're in this final chapter of Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. If you have this edition, that's on page 52. I talked about the character of Jekyll as it's illustrated in this page 52. I talked about how a lot of students like to talk about the development of Jekyll over the course of the novella. And I pointed to this as like one of the beginning incidents of his life. This is what he was like at the beginning of his life. And so it seems like a very important incident to include in any essay that talks about the development or regression, if you will, of Henry Jekyll. Talks about how he suppressed a lot of his appetites at the beginning of his life and how he learned to put on like a face for the public and then a face for himself as well, his private self that he was hiding from everybody versus his public self. A lot of people like to talk about that as a thematic statement. They like to talk about the differences between public self versus the private self. Of course, I would expect for you to tell me those specific differences whenever you wrote that out as a thematic statement. Like you might say, the private self is usually represses taboos or things that the public doesn't accept, for instance. That might be a specific talking point. So he talks about that right there, his split personality that is developed and that we all have. I think Stevenson would argue, in order to be a productive member of society, people probably wouldn't respect me if they knew every single thing that I had ever done. Maybe there are some things that I don't want the public to know about or that I'm ashamed of. And anybody could probably say the same. Bless you. And it's the same case with Jekyll here. If you want to talk about identity in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, here we go. Page 53, the second page of that chapter. He wants to house his suppressed desires in a separate identity from his public self. So it's like the work is implying that a lot of folks who are in polite mannered society, a lot of folks in the higher establishments of society would prefer to separate, their identities so that they can get away with certain things that society doesn't allow. Going forward a little further into this text, we see how much he enjoys delighting in living through Hyde. The work talks about the nature of good and evil, how man is, it seems like when God created him, he has these mixed natures. He's not purely evil and he's not purely good. But Jekyll transgressed the laws of nature by separating these two entities. And so this work seems to study what is purely evil in man. And you can look at Hyde as an examination of what is purely evil. And this is on page 55 right here, and that's a quiz question. It talks about what does it say about the nature of good and evil. And it says right here, all human beings as we meet them are commingled out of good and evil, and Edward Hyde alone, the ranks of mankind, was pure evil. That's a pretty key passage for that question itself. Cameron, are you asking about did Stevenson believe in God, or did Jekyll believe in God? Is that what you're talking about? So there's several times in the story that you see that Jekyll turns to religion, especially every time he seems to falter, every time he seems to make a mistake, he turns to the church, he turns to doing good deeds and stuff like that. He tries to be pious. So, I mean, it seems like, I don't know if I could say that he believes in God, but he definitely acts religiously. I mean, he seeks out the religious whenever he feels like he's done something, he's gone too far. You could point to those examples to say that. Here, the discussion of identity. A lot of people like to talk about identity in this work. This is page 56. Some of the things that Jekyll begins to realize about himself once he's able to separate Hyde from himself is this idea that I did not even exist. This is a really interesting passage right here where he begins to consider his own identity now that he is able to, embody Hyde. I was the first that could thus plod in the public eye with a load of genial respectability, and in a moment, like a schoolboy, strip off these lendings and spread headlong into the sea of liberty. But for me and my impenetrable mantle, the safety was complete. Think of it, I did not even exist. Let me but escape into my laboratory door, and swallow the drought. Whatever he had done, Edward Hyde would pass away. So it's interesting. Think about it. Jekyll is separating himself from this Hyde right here. Now, a lot of us would probably argue Jekyll is responsible for what Hyde does. But Jekyll says, I'm not responsible for what Hyde does. He says Hyde, or this is how he was seeing it. He was saying, Hyde is doing his own thing, and I'm getting away with it because I'm not getting caught, because it's not my face. But it is, a lot of people would argue, his mind that's in there. So it brings up this question of culpability, of who is responsible for what. And if you think about it as what I was saying earlier, that Hyde, if you don't think of Hyde as like a monster, but you think about what he really represents in each of us, you might think about it like this. It might be comparable to a person who, drinks a bunch of alcohol or, takes a drug or something like that, and then goes and does a bunch of stupid stuff at a party. And it's like the next morning, it's like, well, I was drunk, forget it. I was drunk, and then everybody forgives him. It wasn't really you. It was Dionysus who took a hold of you, and allowed you to get rid of all these things. So he's separating himself from his sins. He literally is taking a drug. So a lot of people like to talk about addiction in this story and how addiction becomes a problem for people. It allows us freedom. It allows us social liberty and stuff like that. On 57, we see Hyde portrayed again. We see this is one of his key characteristics, I think, is every act and thought centered on self. Is completely selfish. You can't find anybody more the embodiment of selfishness than Hyde. He drinks pleasure with bestial avidity from any degree of torture to another. So this is another key characteristic of Hyde. He loves to harm other people. So if we're talking about what Jekyll is repressing, a lot of people like to speculate about what specifically is. We know that these are some of the specific things that he's repressing. This desire to harm other people, this hatred of other people that goes below the surface. Maybe it has to do with the fact that society asks us to suppress ourselves, to suppress our selfish desires. Think about American society, for instance. It says, well, personally, I would like to go out and, it'd be nice to not have to work every day. It'd be nice to go out and sleep in as late as I want and to eat whatever I want without repercussion, to have all the cake that I want, to have all the honey buns I want in the morning, to, drink myself into a stupor every night or whatever, whatever I feel like. But society says that you're worthless if you do these things as opposed to, remain sober and go out and work your job every day, earn that money, work hard. So it's like society says that we have to abandon ourselves, our selfish interests, in order to do the greater good. So maybe that's a reason why Hyde hates other people so much, is because society forces him underneath the surface. It effectively uh, kills him, or puts him in prison. Exactly. Uh, and I mean, the way you put that right there, Bailey said, it seems like the work talks about how the individual feels imprisoned by societal constraints and things such as that, and how one of our base desires is to be free, to have freedom and stuff like that. The way you phrase that, it could connect to, it could connect to Whitman as well, but I was talking about Wordsworth is what I meant, and Coleridge and some of those things. But perhaps Wordsworth and Coleridge presented that idea more positively, whereas it's presented negatively right here. What happens when we do have ultimate freedom? Wordsworth would say freedom is a good thing. We need to be free from these societal constraints, go out in nature. This work seems to say, when we have absolute freedom from societal constraints, there are bad things that can happen because people have these awful desires underneath the surface. So you could argue there's two different arguments going on between these two different authors. I've already talked a lot about repression and what this work says about repression, how it connects with Freud and a lot of modern psychology. So I might kind of skip forward after that. We see how once he stops repressing that self, how it begins to take over him, because ultimately Hyde overtakes Jekyll. The more he indulges in pleasure and freedom and all of these things and selfishness, ultimately Hyde stops being so small and becomes stronger. Hyde becomes not the lesser of the personality, but the dominant personality. So it implies that if indeed we allow ourselves unfettered access to these bestial pleasures and stuff like that, that the danger is that that personality will take over our better self. Our better self is not as strong as that bestial self. But it definitely talks about how it can, a lot of people like to talk about mental illness and why people become mentally ill, why they become so imbalanced that they have to seek treatment and stuff like this. And it's hard. I think the work is trying to say, looking at how Jekyll tries to control Hyde, it's hard to control these base instincts. They're so powerful. Uh, and so this might be one of the reasons that mental illness is prevalent. I mean, it's really hard to suppress these base desires. Society asks a lot out of us. Uh, we see what happens when he represses Hyde. He represses him for a long time, and then he lets him out. He finally gives in to the urge, and Hyde is more murderous than ever. That's when Sir Danvers Carew is murdered. Uh, and that murder is brutal. If you can't picture it in your head, he murders Carew with that staff, but he continues beating his dead body until it's such a pulp that it's disfigured. Nobody can recognize what it looks like. Long after he's dead, Hyde smashes his face in. And Carew is like a member of Parliament. So he's like the embodiment of a lawgiver. So if you're talking about what that represents, we see Hyde metaphorically uh, bashing in all of the laws of English society. He is just turning them to pulp, if you look at that metaphorically. Another thing this work explores is like what it's like to be a criminal, the thought process of a criminal, how terrifying and horrifying it can be to be ostracized by society. We see that right here. I was the common quarry of mankind. I was hunted, houseless, a known murderer, a thrall to the gallows. My reason wavered, but it did not fail me utterly. So this is a change in a person that they feel if they feel ostracized from society. It's a terrible experience. What is it like for society to put you off, to hate you? Maybe that's a reason why Hyde is so evil, because society hates him so much. Jekyll continues to deny the fact that he is Hyde, that he and Hyde are the same person. He continues to deny that fact as we go forward. And he keeps trying to suppress Hyde. I think it's important to note that Hyde starts to emerge without the use of the drug. He starts to become so strong. When does that happen? That happens when Jekyll starts feeling better about himself, when he starts feeling like he's sitting in the park right there and he starts wondering how, in a lot of ways, he's a better man than the other people he sees. When he starts feeling that condescension toward other people, feeling like he's better than other people, that's when he starts turning into Hyde in public without the drug. And it is after that that he basically can't control the change anymore. I think it's important to note how Jekyll talks about this, how Hyde's tendency to commit suicide. Of course, Hyde does commit suicide in the end of the work, and Jekyll calls it every time that Hyde takes the draught to turn into Jekyll. Now we have Hyde taking the medicine to turn into Jekyll. He commits temporary suicide to return to a subordinate station of a part instead of a person, to avoid the gallows, to avoid, having to be murdered. I mean, not murdered, but put to death because of the murder he committed. And Hyde is an example of a person who wants to commit self-suicide, and arguably Jekyll is as well. Every time that Jekyll takes the draught, he is in essence killing himself, because he no longer physically exists. He turns into somebody else. We already talked last time about this horror of Jekyll looking in the mirror and seeing his own face, and how sadly altered it was when he saw Hyde. We talked about that. We had a really good discussion about that on Friday. So I think we can skip over that. You see, even at the end, this idea of disassociation, how Jekyll disassociates from Hyde, this altered part of him, he says, that's not me. This is how he ends his confession. This is his confessional. It's the end of the novella as well. He says, I'm careless. I can't turn back into myself. I can't control this anymore. What happens concerns another other than myself. So here then, as I lay down the pen and proceed to seal up my confession, I bring to the end, the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll. So he talks about what happens at the end is not me. This fact that Hyde killed himself, it was not me. People also like to talk about the structure of this work, the way that the narrative is hidden within another narrative, is hidden within another narrative. We get the letter of Dr. Jekyll, which is the last thing that we see, but we also have the Dr. Lanyon narrative. And so there's all kinds of little stories hidden within stories, hidden within stories. They like to talk about how the structure talks uh, is kind of similar to this idea of identity. Anything else anybody wants to add about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? All right, well, let's start moving toward Oscar Wilde and his importance of being earnest. I think that this subtitle, A Trivial Comedy for Serious People, has to be kept in mind as you read this work. I like how I've combined these two stories for a reason, okay? I think that they have a lot of the same themes, have a lot of the same thematic topics. This idea of a public self versus a private self is also a key theme in this work as well. This idea of polite mannered society hiding something else that perhaps might not be taken uh, as respectable underneath the surface of things. That's talked about in both the works. The idea of dual identities, the idea of, one's public identity being different than the private identity. This is also true. Uh, the idea of questioning what is moral and what isn't is also another thing that's going on in this work. But there are a lot of key differences as well. Cameron asks about to keep himself sane, would you say that Hyde killed Jekyll? Uh, I think that, talking about that suicide at the end right there, Hyde committed suicide because he was about to be captured. He was about to be discovered. So he didn't want to be captured and be taken uh, and put in jail and then hang on the gallows. So he took his own life. So he took his own life into his own hands. He loves freedom so much, is how I always interpret it there, that he takes his life into his own hands. By killing himself, he also killed Jekyll. But this work here, there's a lot of key differences between the two works. This is a comedy. It's a farce as opposed to a horror on the last one. So instead of looking at this idea of public persona versus private persona and how horrible or horrifying that can be, in a lot of ways, this work glorifies the idea that you can have a public and a private persona. This idea of a Bunburyist, which you have already heard about when you're talking about Algernon and how Algernon has this invented personality, Bunbury, that he uses in order to go out and go have fun, pretends to be somebody else in order to do some things that he might not be able to get away with otherwise. It's presented positively. It's a cool thing to have this personality because life would be frickin' boring if you aren't able to do that. So it's almost the exact opposite of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. One thing that I see some people saying is the thematic statement is, which kind of misses the whole point of this work right here. Sometimes people will say the work implies that it's very important to be truthful. And if that, then that misses the whole point of the work right here. This is all satire. It's all sarcasm. The idea, there is no, it's important to not be earnest, but at the same time, the work, it's a pun. It's a play on words. It's important not to be truthful in order to enjoy life. But at the same time, it's important to be earnest, or at least to pretend to be earnest. You notice right here from this title right here that we're going to know everything that we see in this work is going to be playful. Anytime we try to see some meaning, it's going to be undercut. It's a trivial comedy for serious people. How can you have a trivial thing for serious people? So continuously we see how playful Wilde is in this work right here. And if there's one, thematic topic that we haven't talked about so far, it's the importance of having fun with life, the importance of not taking things seriously, uh, uh, the importance of being able to look at everything that usually serious people take to be a serious problem trivially is one of the ways to really, truly enjoy life. The work praises people who are able to look at serious topics as if they're trivial. So, in other words, let's transition a little bit when we're talking about Stevenson versus Wilde. Wilde was, of course, a famously flamboyant character. He loved to dress up and to, have really cool outfits and stuff like that. He always was a standout at every party. He loved to party. Uh, he was, nowadays you might call him flamingly gay. I mean, he was definitely out there. I think if he was around nowadays, he would definitely be at every drag show. Uh, he would be having a good time. He would love RuPaul and all these things. But of course, he couldn't get away with as many things then as he could now. And living this flamboyant lifestyle got him in a lot of trouble. We got him in a lot of, he got put on trial famously and was put in jail for having a gay relationship with a man. And this experience that he had in prison, he was likely molested and raped in prison. This experience of being in prison, basically brought him to the end of his life. He didn't live much longer after he was in prison. But this is long before that, in 1895. This work, as you read it here, keep a sense of humor. Notice that everything has two meanings, okay? Like I said, just from the title right here, don't take anything too seriously. And Wilde doesn't take anything seriously. He proceeds in this work to look at everything that a serious English moralist or English person would take as something that we all need to take seriously. He seems to say, why? Why? So marriage, we look at the idea of marriage. And if you read the first act, you see that idea of marriage continuously being brought up in this first act. The people who are married and who themselves are, constantly in basically a single marital relationship. These are the boring people, the people who, it's fun if you get a third person involved, is one of the things it says. This idea of money and wealth and how marriage should be based on arranged marriages and all of these various things. We see in Lady Bracknell, if there is an antagonist in this work, if there's one person who's seriously being criticized, it's Lady Bracknell. And she represents that polite, mannered society, what British people think should happen in a good marriage. And she's constantly being criticized, her idea of what makes a good marriage. Let's take a look at some of the text. So we have some key characters. We have Algernon, and we have, one of the things that people struggle with is that there's different names, right? So we have Jack, John, Ernest, Worthing. Okay, that's the same person. All right. In the city, Jack or John Worthing pretends to be Earnest, the guy named Earnest. In the country where he lives, he pretends to be, he is Jack or John Worthing. So that is technically his real personality. He's a polite, respectable country gentleman, and then he will say or lie and pretend that I'm going to the city to visit my relative, Ernest. And he's been living this double life for a long time. In media res, we start where he's been living this double life for a long time. And Algernon in this, or Algernon, in this first act, discovers the fact that he's been living this double life. And Algernon reveals that he himself has been living a double life. How fun is it to live a double life? Life would be pretty boring if we didn't have this ability to go out and pretend to be somebody else. The work, in a lot of ways, talks about how fun it is to pretend. You know, I have a kid. I have a 9-year-old. She loves to play pretend. And in a lot of ways, I think the life of American society, the coolest people in American society are the kids in American society. I know that myself whenever I go to a wedding and I play music at a wedding, and guess who's the first people out on the dance floor? The kids, right? They don't have to have alcohol to go out and have fun. They don't have to have drugs to go out and have fun. The kids come out and they are ready to have a good time. It's because they don't care about that public self. You know, they're willing to be themselves, to be whoever they are. They're willing to play. And this work, in every way, if you're talking about one thing that it praises the idea of play and having fun. And this idea of having a double self is a way that they have fun. I think it's important to note the distinction. They're not going out and really harming anybody else, like Hyde would be, like murdering anybody or beating up anybody. They're not doing a whole lot of harm. It's all in a different spirit, a spirit of not being so serious, of taking serious life less seriously. So I know we don't have much longer, but I just want to bring up just a couple little things. You're going to see little tidbits like this right here. There's this, I love the Butler Lane who comes in and, you know, he's serving these cucumbers and he's constantly playing the game he's playing along with Algernon. He knows that, you know, Algernon is, anything he says is not serious, and he plays along with him. I was talking about marriage right there and how it doesn't take marriage serious right here. Lane says, I've only been married once. That was in consequence of a misunderstanding between myself and a young woman. You know, it's like, why take marriage seriously if sometimes this happens right there? We see that Algernon and Ernest drank 8 bottles of wine, and then he blames it on the servants right there. You know, so why is it that the servants drink all the wine and Lane plays along? You know, he's like, oh yeah, blah blah blah. This is wine, of course. It's the good quality of the wine in a bachelor household. And you see, Algernon criticizes Lane's views of marriage. He says they seem somewhat lax. Really, if the lower orders don't set us a good example, what on earth is the use of them? They seem as a class to have absolutely no sense of moral responsibility. All of this is tongue-in-cheek, okay? Because later on, Algernon espouses the same philosophy, lax views on marriage and stuff like that. And he knows that. And it's like saying, usually this is the inverse of the way the society thinks that things should happen, that the upper classes are the ones who are the morally respectable, whereas the lower classes are the ones who aren't morally respectable. And he says, the lower classes should teach us how to act. And that's the opposite of the way society usually works. Again, he's just playing with this idea that anything should be taken seriously.